Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Executive Director of the Siegel Family Foundation, Andy Bryant.
And the rest of our esteemed panel.
Oh, I can't see. I'm so
Comfortable? Ready?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're approaching the end of this first glorious day of the Global Philanthropy Forum 2022. It's my honor and privilege to moderate a panel of truly exemplary individuals here on stage with me. First, let me give a shout out to the GPF team. For those of you who attended GPFs of yore, many years ago, I think the theme this year could be the changing faces of GPF. I'm a very grateful exception to sort of the norm today, as your sort of standard issue white male funder, getting the spotlight up here. I think it's to their credit, to their far-sightedness, that they are truly changing the face of this stage and this spotlight. So well done to the GPF crew. And today we're going to, another theme perhaps could be conversations with consequences. We're going to talk about localization today. It's a theme that I'm really familiar with. In some ways, it's well-trodden ground. It's been beaten to death in the last few years. The social justice movements of the past few years have unearthed a lot of really spicy, interesting, sensitive conversations, one of which falls under this guise of localization. But I think too often these conversations happen in places without consequence. But if you look to your left and right in this room, gosh, I don't know, setting aside even the USG money and influence here, we must have, I don't know, 40 or 50 billion dollars in assets and capital and power in this room. So suddenly this conversation that's been important has the gravity of consequence attached to it, and that's really exciting. I'm assuming, by now, probably most everyone in this room has made their mind up about the justness and the justice and the impactfulness of investing in locally led development and vision. There's probably some skeptics in the room, funders who find the notion of proximate-led development quaint or naive. Some of my most respected peers have lobbed accusations of virtue signaling or naivete towards my own organization, the Siegel Family Foundation, in our desire to identify, nurture, and springboard local rock stars in East and Southern Africa. But I think for the most part, we're fairly philosophically aligned. So our work here today as a panel is to move from rhetoric to action. My hope is that each of us in this room leave today with maybe a real tangible, a concrete pathway that we could put proof to purpose in our desire to not only espouse, champion, laud investing in local knowledge, but also giving it teeth, giving it action, moving it forward. To get us started, I asked our esteemed panelists to give us 3 things today. To be honest, tell us why you're here. Okay, so there's a no solicitation or fundraising policy here at GPF. I think we all have our wares to sell, and we all have an idea to convey, right? We wouldn't be here if it were not that. So I'm asking each of us on the panel to name that, to be honest about our intentions here. Secondly, to be bold. I don't think we're going to have any shortage of provocation or meaningfulness in the remarks from our panelists, but I gave them that prompt. And finally, to be vulnerable. We're funders, so we're really bad at recognizing our own shortcomings, and certainly in saying them out loud, and talking about the things that we as individuals or as organizations are working on, right? We're great about telling our grantees what they need to be working on, but not so great when the hot lamp turns towards ourselves. I will start. I'll model this honesty, boldness, and vulnerability. So let me start by being honest. I think panels like this can oftentimes be really underwhelming. You're trying to put a whole lot of brilliance into far too small a space, too short a time, too narrow a mandate. and the results can be, yeah, frankly, a little bit underwhelming. So why am I here? Why am I taking part in this very flawed format? Well, because I think that the brilliance is not just on this stage, but it's also in this audience. I think there's enough potential energy in the form of our capital and our shared enthusiasm and innovation and ideas in this crowd to do some truly transformative things if we can just find those specific and tangible pathways to put our capital to good use. In terms of being bold, let me be bold. I think as funders, we're often afraid. We're afraid of change. We're afraid of trying new things. We're afraid of being described as too woke. We're afraid of being described as not woke enough. We're afraid of being seen as piggy banks. We're afraid of being piggy banks and nothing more. Fear, fear, fear. And I think sometimes we cloak that fear in the guise of risk. So we shelter ourselves in risk mitigation strategies and all sorts of log frames to guard against risk. But I think as funders, being a little bit hyperbolic, I think we have one real risk, and that's missed opportunities, right? Even the 40 or 50 billion, and that's a back of the envelope calculation, even that 40 or 50 billion dollars is so insufficient to solve nearly any problem. We probably couldn't solve homelessness in San Francisco with $50 billion if we just blunt force set our minds to it. What we can do is serve as the venture capital for awesome ideas. And to one of the earlier panelist points, also serve as the survival capital for ideas that are no longer in vogue, as localization has been for the past few decades. So we need to take advantage of the opportunities in front of us. And today, just to beat that dead horse, it's to find practical pathways to put our capital to use in service of investing in local knowledge. Okay, finally, let me be vulnerable. I'm a white guy who was raised in Wyoming, moderating a panel on investing in local knowledge with an eye towards giving agency power of purse strings to proximate leaders across the global south. That's a bit of an ill fit, and I have to say, my vulnerability stems from waking up every day and looking myself in the mirror and asking myself, what value, what place do I have in these conversations, which, like I said, happen all the time. Today, I justify my existence on this stage by saying that a role I feel very comfortable in, which is a glorified doorman. I open up and create spaces for others who have a heck of a lot more talent and more articulate and more important and unfortunately more experienced voices to shine. And so without further ado, and more hot air from my part, I want to introduce our esteemed panelists and ask them to also exercise boldness, honesty, and vulnerability. I'll start with Dagan Ali, Executive Director of Adesso. Give us some honesty, boldness, and vulnerability.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's really hard to follow that. So I'm here to use my privilege and my access to these spaces to move and change behavior to decolonize philanthropy. I'm very privileged. I hold an American passport, so that means I can travel to these spaces. I don't have to wait 6 months to a year to get a visa, like many people in my home country of Somalia can't even get a visa, or Kenya. So I'm very privileged, and I try to do my best to speak, to represent in my flawed way those who don't have access to these spaces. And most importantly, let's talk about the things that need to change. So the Council on Foundations has said that about only 12% of foundation funding is going to Global South organizations in their last report. I think that's actually a very generous number. I think it's much less than that. That's just philanthropy. We're not talking about ODA, OECD donors, the bilaterals. We're just talking about philanthropy. In the humanitarian space, it's estimated to be about 2%. When I started this journey in 2014 during the World Humanitarian Summit, we were at 0.2%. And I was just had the honor of listening to in climate justice activists, youth activists, and they was talking about how in the climate justice space, youth groups are only funded 0.76%. And that includes both Global North youth movements and Global South youth movements. So if you include just the South alone, it's going to be less than 0.76. So these are just some of the realities of what we're talking about. So if I'm to be bold, I would also like to kind of change a little bit about our perception about the space that we hold here, and to say that we're all philanthropists. I argue that the biggest philanthropists are actually not in the room, and they are the poor. They are the marginalized. They are the biggest philanthropists. And we ignore them, and we think that philanthropy is attached to having a large endowment or being a stockholder of a major company like Amazon or Facebook. But we forget that the poor every day exercise philanthropy, and they probably exercise the most riskiest, costliest, and biggest philanthropy. When you're living on $1 a day, to give 20% of that, that's very risky to your neighbor, to make sure that your neighbor eats with you, to take the time out of your schedule to give free childcare, hours of childcare to your neighbor's child, because the mother is working as a housekeeper for somebody and living in these rich neighborhoods of Nairobi. That's the kind of philanthropy that happens every day that's invisible, that we don't think about. So, having said that, once you think about that, I think we need to start thinking of philanthropy as a gift. And it's a bounty that is a blessing. We need to stop thinking about it as a transaction. We need to realize that those who have should feel honored and privileged to be giving to those who have not. That it's not about getting a tax break. It's not about, oh, I'm a program officer and I have to do my job and move this money. That I have the honor of actually taking my bounty, what has been blessed to me, and giving it to those who don't have that privilege. So I feel like that's an important thing that we have to remember, that this is not just a job, that this is an opportunity, missed opportunities, as Andy said. Now, in terms of vulnerability, I would just say that I had the honor to be featured on the cover of Social Investor with Chandler Foundation. I'm very grateful to them, and I just put on braces. I just put on braces like 6 months ago, so I was just like, oh my God, a cover page right now when I have braces. So I was not happy, honestly. But I will later talk about some of the messages in the article that I've written, but I will tell you just a little bit about the practice that led to this cover. That was very different. So I don't want to put them out, but first of all, they were so generous in putting a Global South woman hijabi on the cover, number one. Number two, they said, well, can you go to a studio and take some pictures? And I was like, no, I want to go to my home. I want to go to Somalia. And I want you to hire African photographers in my space. And they said yes. And they'd never done that in any cover. So we need to understand that decolonization is not just about moving money, but it's about really transforming some things that seem so simple and just basic, like taking pictures, is extremely powerful. So let me end there. Thank you.
Oh, me? Okay. Sure.
Next, sorry, let me introduce you. Navin Salem, founder and CEO of Adisia. Please.
Yeah, so I'll take you back about 15 years and just tell you a story about my father, who is from Tanzania. And there was a day when I think I needed some extra sleep. I had 4 daughters under the age of 5, and so I decided to convince my father to go back to Tanzania and have a look around and see what was being done, but more importantly, see what was not being done. And I remember being in a clinic with him and witnessing malnutrition for the first time in my life. Now, as I had a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old and a couple of 5-year-olds at home, I was very familiar with what children should look like at those particular ages. And as I sat in that clinic, I saw a child, and I said, how old is your little one? Come to find out, what I think is a newborn is a 2.5-year-old. And it was at that moment that I thought to myself, how can this still be happening? And how can we not be doing something about it? There is this unnerving silence when you walk into a malnutrition clinic. Babies there don't have the energy to cry. They are preserving everything that they have to keep their hearts beating. Their skin is breaking, their hair is turned a different color because of the lack of nutrition. And in fact, 8,000 children die every day from malnutrition. And this is 100% preventable. And I found myself putting myself in the shoes of mothers in Tanzania and wondering what it must feel like to lose one to something as simple as food and nutrition. And simply because of where this child is born, that is the outcome that they have to deal with. So I learned about this magical product called Plumpy Nut. It looks like this. And in this little packet is peanuts, milk powder, sugar, vegetable oil, and tons of vitamins and minerals. It's like a food by prescription, so 3 times a day, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It can completely rehabilitate a child. We're not only able to save lives with this magical food, but it's building the brains and that cognitive development in children at young ages, specifically under the age of 5, and we're even trying to go under the age of 3 or 2 if we can. Because if we're able to deliver those micronutrients, we're able to save that brain, and that brain power stays with you for life. And the other wonderful thing about this is it doesn't need to be refrigerated or mixed with water, 2 things that are just not easily available. And it allows mothers to take this product home and their children home. So we're not taking up spaces in the malnutrition clinics, and we're letting parents get on with the work that they have to do and taking care of other children. And so it really allows us to reach just way more children than we could before. So I love this tangible concept. And so I decided to start a factory, first in Tanzania and later in Rhode Island, where I live, to see if we could make more of this food. And it was basically, I've been doing this now for 14 years, and I thought, okay, the need in the world has kind of leveled off, and maybe I should start diversifying and doing new things. But then everything started to fall apart, right? The world is a mess. We have conflicts going on in 45 countries. We have climate change. A pandemic isn't even registering in my world anymore. The climate change that's been going on for years, droughts in East Africa that have lasted over 4 years, those are the things that are contributing so greatly. So Somalia is about to declare a famine. Why are we waiting? We know this is going to happen. We see it happening. We've seen it been forming for all these years, so why do we wait for this to happen? Haiti is basically nearly a failed state. And then you have Russia that decided just this week that they were going to continue the blockade of grain to the rest of the world. This is causing food insecurity and mass hunger and starvation like we have never seen before. This then, the fact that the cost of bread is 3 times mean that families cannot feed their families today. It's not going to happen, it has already happened. This then leads to political instability, violence, the need to overthrow your government and protests in the streets, which we've seen in all kinds of countries all over the world. In fact, I was recently in Sierra Leone, and we talk about supply chains a lot in this upside-down world. And I met this mother of twins. I happen to have twins too. And she told me the story of when she came to the clinic. Both of her daughters were malnourished. And when she arrived, there was no Plumpy Nut available. And she lost one of her children, simply because our supply chain broke. Now that's on us. We did not do a good enough job of making sure that the supply was where it needs to be. So we have ships going in every direction. We even flew a few planes to Chad the other day, which we try not to do. That's not good use of funds. Trying to make sure that these supply chains don't break. And the only equivalent I can kind of draw is if you remember the baby food formula shortage this summer. Now, this was on the news every single day. And what did we do? We started flying planes in from Europe. And we were not recommending that parents just go to the next aisle over and buy cookies for your child. Why not? Because babies only can have baby formula, right? There's a reason why they're on that baby formula. So we make the equivalent of baby formula in the global south, right? And so if that product is not on shelf when those mothers have walked hours to come to the clinic to get it, it is a life and death situation. There are lots of problems in this world, very complicated ones, that we don't know how to solve. Malnutrition is not one of them.
Thank you. Last but not least, Fatima Sumar, Executive Director of the Harvard Center for International Development.
Thanks,
Be
Andy.
honest, be vulnerable, be bold.
Thank you. So I will take your provocations up, Andy. So honestly, I'm not supposed to be up here. And a lot of my career, and I've been very privileged to work in very elite institutions and elite spaces. I'm kind of an accident of history in many ways, and it's because a few generations ago, my parents had the courage to try to escape their own situations of extreme poverty. And they left behind their families in Malaysia, in India, to try to make it here in the United States. And through a very rough up and down journey, my sisters and I were able to escape generational poverty that they had been experiencing that gone back, in many cases, like my father and my mother's, for about 6 generations at least that we can count. And so, I think a lot about the privilege that I have had in my career, in my life, my kids' lives. And I have tried to translate that privilege in working, and I've worked in very elite institutions, both in the US government, in civil society, and now in academia, to think about how to be as disruptive and as provocative as possible in some of those spaces, to really put the point of view of those who are on the front lines every single day and forgotten in a lot of these elite spaces. And so when we think about, Andy, localization, and we think about what we have to do and not what we should do, because I think we're beyond that conversation, and think about where we're going. I want to be bold, and I'm going to put 3 thoughts out there that may feel very uncomfortable. And it's one of the reasons I actually just recently joined the Center for International Development at Harvard to partner with Professor Asim Khwaja to actually think about a new vision to put out there of how we can actually completely shift this development paradigm. So for my first bold thought that I'll test out on all of you of shifting this paradigm is we move away from anti-poverty altogether. And let me explain what I mean by that. When we talk about poverty, when we talk about ending poverty, fighting poverty, addressing poverty, we're actually talking about artificial barriers that the World Bank and other elite institutions have set that you should be at $2, $5, $7, $13, and once you get to this artificial threshold that someone set in Brussels or Geneva or in DC, we're not going to invest in you anymore. We're done. We actually have no responsibility towards you anymore. And we can move on to the next person, and the next, and the next, and let you kind of get stuck in that journey moving forward. So my first bold proposition as we think about localization is, what if we moved completely from anti-poverty as a way of thinking to pro-opportunity for all? And it's why our center's new mission is to build a thriving world for all. And you won't see the word poverty actually showing up in how we speak about this anymore. Because we've got a lot of people on this planet, and they all deserve the full potential to use their God-given gifts, whatever they may be. And they may have started out in generational poverty, they may be trying to escape it, they may be falling back in because of different vulnerabilities. They may be somewhere stuck in the middle, but they could slide back in, or their kids could slide back in if we forget about them. And in fact, I would say a lot of what we're seeing of political protest movements in a lot of democracies, including right here in the United States, are because of this exact paradigm. Here's my second bold proposition. We move away completely from thinking of ourselves in terms of charity, and we think about, as actually the Chandler Foundation said in their intro of the magazine that Dagon talked about, to talk about being social investors and social investment. Because it's a completely different paradigm shift when we actually think about building equity. Equity, not just grants, because the vehicle of what you do with your money, there's lots of different options. But we think differently about that frame. And the third frame is we move our sight from risk and we start seeing potential. Dagon, you said something that really resonated with me, and this links to the previous two working groups that I had the honor of sitting in on. We think a lot about taking risks about our money, and I know, because I've been on the front lines of implementing multi-billion-dollar programs for the US government and other spaces. So I thought about my risk portfolio all the time. I ran cost-benefit analysis, I ran the math, I talked to our economists, I talked to our lawyers, I talked to many people to make sure that when my name went on the check, if I got hauled in front of Congress or inspector generals, I could explain why I gave $1 billion to Burkina Faso, even though there were 2 coups there recently, right? But actually, when you think about it, I can afford to take a whole lot of risk. I really can. And the very people who actually take the risk every single day are those on the front lines, women in Afghanistan, and others who actually are willing to die, literally die or get whipped for what they believe in a way that I, in my fancy boardrooms, never have to even consider or think about. So my third bold proposition as we think about localization is to shift our eyesight. Let's stop obsessing about our own risk in the comfort of our boardrooms and think about embracing and seeing potential and possibility. As I think about the frame here, one of the things I wanted to leave you with, and I wrote a book about this last year that frames some of this, called The Development Diplomat. A lot of the work that all of us are doing in this space right now comes out of the breakup of colonial empires, post-World War II era, and the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions that really still to this day are our architectural framework for how we think about poverty. Now, when those institutions were formed, and you think about the world in the 1960s, this is just 60 years ago, what percentage of the world lived in extreme poverty? Anyone want to just shout out a number? But you have to really shout because I can't hear you. 40, 60, 70, 80% of the world, more than 80% of the world lived in extreme poverty just 60 years ago. Now, that's not surprising. I mean, think about the breakup of colonial empires and the consequences of unplanned transitions that took place. That's what a lot of these global institutions that the West created were set up to do. But out of those institutions, in fact, very little architecturally transitioned into development financing and spaces. So it's why in the US government context, you have 1% of the entire US budget goes to international development. It's why in the US context, but also in the UK and many other spaces, that decisions on international development don't sit with USAID. They sit where I sat, at the State Department, or in Congress, or in the White House, or even in the Defense Department, depending on what it is we're talking about, right? When we think about the 1% is in the news a lot. And in fact, I just published an article on inequality today talking about the 1%. But I want to talk about different ways of thinking about this 1%. We think about 1% of US government financing goes to official development assistance. 1% of the humanitarian sector goes to local organizations. And 1% of the richest Americans also own 35% of our wealth right now, right? So Oxfam has calculated, and I was privileged to work at Oxfam a few years ago, but Oxfam has calculated that today the world's richest 10 people, so 10, literally my fingers, 10 people have more wealth than 3.1 billion people, right? That's like all the women in Africa, just to put this in context. So when we talk about the 1%, there's lots of ways to slice and dice this number and to think about what it is we're doing. But when we talk about it in the context of localization, you have to think about, is our legacy collectively in this room, for the 40 billion, 50 billion that's being represented here, is our legacy really to decide how the 99% should actually live? Is that power? Do we want that responsibility? Because that's a pretty heavy responsibility to hold and to have. And I would argue that, not only do we have a fundamental responsibility, there is a massive shift that is already taking place in societies all around the world as inequality explodes, including right here in the United States, that is demanding that we think differently. So I'll just end really on 10 seconds on the vulnerability space here, which is, I think to do this differently, it is not, the localization conversation, and I'm really, Dagan, congrats to you and so many others in the space that have really been pushing for the shift in funding in particular. It's a yes, and so much of the structural shifts that also have to take place for us to be able to do this right. And I know we're going to have that conversation around what some of those practical strategies look like. But my vulnerability that I want to share with you is that I do think it is really hard, actually, not just to shift the funding, which is actually probably the easiest of the steps, but to structurally give up power because it is the right thing to do, because it's the only thing we have to do to be able to do this, is structurally sticky and stubborn. But I also, what gives me hope and optimism and why I'm still in this space to be able to do this, is if we can go down from 80% of the world just 60 years ago to where we are today, around 10%, and hopefully improving and getting better with the work to come, then I think we can do the remaining 10%. And so that's where I'm today.
Cool, thank you. Naven, maybe I'll start with you. You described a little bit about your background. Your family's from Tanzania. You cut your teeth in the ready-to-use therapeutic food space by building that first factory in TZ. But you're from Rhode Island, right? This is a panel on investing in local knowledge. In your bio, it says, Adicia engages intentionally and thoughtfully with the global aid ecosystem, prioritizing solidarity with local communities it serves. What does solidarity look like in practice? How do you take something that's timely, much needed, and could be considered too important to slow down and try to understand local context and actors?
Yeah.
How does that solidarity look?
Yeah, so there's three ways that we engage with local communities. And the first is our business model is a hybrid business model. So we are 95% social enterprise, 5% traditional nonprofit. So what that means is the 95%, the social enterprise part, means I'm selling to UNICEF, the World Food Program, USAID. Those are big dollars. Those funds are going to the Afghanistans of the world, Yemen, the bigger problems and crises. The 5% I'm fundraising for, and I'm giving directly in-kind free product to the smallest NGOs you could think of. And so these are outside of that United Nations system, but we don't want to forget about them. So Guatemala, they might not have millions of children who need help, but they're still children. So we use this balance of two different business models at the same time to be able to address the largest crises and the smallest ones at the same time. So that's one way. We're supporting literally a doctor in Sudan who runs one hospital, and we supply him every single year. He can depend on that. So it's wonderful to develop these relationships and know people over a long period of time. The second way we engage locally is we're part of a network of 12 producers. So I do the US, but my partners are in Haiti, Burkina Faso, Madagascar, Ethiopia, India, etc. We all work together. We all are here for a different reason. So those are factories put in malnutrition hotspots so that we're not spending money on delivery. We're creating local businesses that can use local raw materials and local human resources to be able to work within those countries that need it desperately. The US is needed, and why I'm needed in Rhode Island is because some of the funding is required to come through the United States. So we advocate for local and regional procurement, and we balance it. We're not going to set up a factory in Yemen. It just doesn't make any sense to do it that way. And lastly, We at Adicia are 110 employees from 25 different countries. And so many of my teammates are former refugees. This is not a charitable part of our mission, it's good business. We have extreme diversity, so we have this knowledge base of people who were born and raised in refugee camps. So now as we're delivering there, my staff is very knowledgeable about places that we're shipping, languages, roads, war zones, etc. They can help bring that local knowledge to what we're doing every day to make sure that it's getting to the end recipients. So on all three levels, I would highly recommend partnering in many different ways it's possible to partner with locals.
Cool, thank you. Dagan? I'm not sure I know anyone who's more active in developing practical solutions for funders, for Western sources of resources than you. What's cooking for you lately? I hear you've got a big, bad pledge for change, and pledges are, you throw a rock at a development conference, you might hit 3 pledges square in the eye. So what's this pledge? What makes it different, new, unique?
Yeah, so I don't know if everybody knows what the Grand Bargain is. During the World Humanitarian Summit in 2014 to 2016, there was all these consultations that were done across the world, and mostly in the Global South. And it's during that time that we were trying to look at trying to organize a movement of Global South civil society actors in the humanitarian space that could challenge the system. And this is our challenge of equity in funding, our challenge of decision-making and sharing power in decision-making is how the term localization came about. And it's during that time that I came up with a target of 20% by 2020 that later became the Grand Bargain commitment of 25%, which is all the bilaterals signed on to, all the OECD countries. So when you hear Samantha Power last year talking about 25%, the genesis of that 25% number comes from the Grand Bargain. So I had seen the Grand Bargain process, and I had seen how negotiated UN-led processes are. And I had seen the bureaucracy, the watering down, the lack of inclusion, how we were pushed aside. We officially asked to be part of this negotiation. So if you imagine a room of bilaterals, Global North NGOs, UN agencies, and there's no Global South civil society representation, number one. There's no Global South governments. Recipient countries' governments are not at the table. Private sector from the Global South are not at the table. I literally would go into rooms in 2014, 2016, where I think I would see 1 or 2 Black and brown people. And all of this conversation was about how we help Black and brown people. And we're not even in the room. So that's when I was like, I engaged in that process, but I saw from the inside how deeply rotten it was, honestly. And I called the Grand Bargain a grand failure. And then during the same time, we initiated a process of trying to change the INGOs through this thing called the Charter for Change. And it was another pledge document. And me and a woman from CAFOD sat together in Geneva writing it. She said to me, if you were, as a local organization, what are the demands that you have of INGOs and how they change their behavior? We came up with 10 things that we wanted, including like sharing equitably overheads. And we gave a minimum percentage, a minimum of 10% has to be shared with your partners. Right now, they give 0. So they expect us to work for free, but when they come to you, they charge you 15, 20%, yeah? And they come to us, and they take your $1 million that they get from your foundation, they charge 15% for doing business, and then they give 0 to the partner on the ground. So what does that mean? That the partner is actually subsidizing and is a free, invisible donor to your funding. We're not counted, you see? So the invisibility I was talking about, the philanthropy happening in the poor, that's injustice after injustice, where the Global South, the last mile delivery, the frontline actors, the ones who risk their lives every day in Yemen and Afghanistan, those women, those groups are the ones who get absolutely no recognition in the Guardian or the New York Times. They get no visibility, and they're expected to work for free and subsidize the work that you guys fund. So these are the kinds of really serious injustices that happen in the system. So anyways, when we did this Charter for Change, this document that was pretty radical got watered down to something completely different. And that's when I threw my hands up and I said, I'm done with this. I'm done with these people. And then 2020 came around, the murder of George Floyd and BLM, COVID, and all of that. Words like racism that were not allowed to be used in the sector, people were actually using words like that. We started calling things, instead of localization, decolonization. People used to be very angry at me for using these terminology before 2020. Now I could actually be in a room and not be attacked for using this terminology. And so I saw that some CEOs were struggling on this journey. They were in the early stages. They didn't know what to do. Some were more advanced. Some, like Oxfam, were more advanced. So I handpicked a few CEOs because I also recognize that whenever you get into a negotiated space, when you get large numbers, everything gets watered down. And so I said, I want also commitment. People have to be genuinely committed. So we had retreats, virtual retreats, 3 hours every month for a year and a half. These CEOs gave me 3 hours of their time every month for a year and a half. And they came and they showed up and they were listening and they heard from Global South actors and we facilitated that. This is the only time I know of where there was a negotiated process that was led by the Global South. And so that culminated in this document. It's not as radical as I would like it to be. I'm not happy about it 100%, but I had to compromise. There was things that I would love to have addressed in this document, like poverty, child sponsorship. I want to end child sponsorship. In my opinion, I think that's the most grotesque version of poverty porn. But unfortunately, it was a red line for some of the NGOs. Why? Because child sponsorship is bread and butter. It's a huge portion of their income is earned through child sponsorship. Anything that has a direct link to income is always a touchy issue. Always. So what we decided is we came up with some negotiated things like equitable partnerships. So we said, okay, you're not going to end child sponsorship. Let's talk about how you show up on the ground. Are you going to open offices or are you going to be working directly with partners? You're not going to open offices, come in, parachute in, boots on the ground, spend all the money that the donor has given you to fund this infrastructure that's not needed when you could be putting that money into your partner. And they said, yes, default is partnership now. And all of these ambitions, some are so advanced, like Christian Aid, a lot of the faith-based organizations are all partnership-based. Some NGOs, I won't mention names, are further away. So it's a journey that they have to do, which is why we said, let's be aspirational, but think long-term, and that's 2030, that's the target. So we have all of these commitments now, and this is now where the rubber hits the road, is accountability. How do we hold them accountable? As we said, there's a lot of pledges, but there's virtually no accountability mechanisms in place currently. So right now, we're working with Ringo and others in developing a Global South-led accountability mechanism. We want their communities to evaluate them. We want their partners to evaluate them. We want a peer evaluation process. We want it all to be public and transparent, and they're going to be putting it out there on the website every year at the end of the year. So these are the things that we're working through, and we want metrics. So it's not just the pledge, the words, the language. We want real numbers. So your baseline is here now. You're doing 80% direct implementation. You're giving 0 overheads. We want to see your progress over time. So those are the practical things that this Pledge for Change, and it includes CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, Plan International, and Christian Aid. Those were the core members that really stuck through it for a year and a half. Now we have just signed on IRC, and Action Aid and Interaction has said that they would sign on, which is really honestly quite surprising for me that they were so quick to do it. But yeah, there's momentum now. So, but as I said, the real test of this, the might of this is accountability. The second thing I think is in practical solutions, we can be aspirational, but we also have to think about barriers that funders have, real legitimate barriers. So the kind of barriers that we always hear is we don't know who's out there. And I discourage funders from doing exactly what the NGOs do and opening offices all over the Global South and using the money that should be invested in your partners in your own infrastructure. So if you're sitting in San Francisco or if you're sitting in London, how do you have visibility of a woman-led organization working on health issues in Uganda? You don't right now. Great example, Ukraine. People are sending in requests on LinkedIn, Twitter, when Russia invaded Ukraine, saying, who are great partners that we can work with? So they're just sending each other lists randomly. This is very inefficient, and we need to do better. So right now, we're working on an online LinkedIn-like platform called Kuja Link. Kuja in Swahili means come. So it's basically like a LinkedIn where Global South organizations, actually global organizations, it initially started off for Global South, but we're opening it up for everybody. We're going to, if indigenous organizations in the US want to be profiled, they're welcome to. If Ukrainian organizations, Polish organizations want to be profiled, they're welcome to. So they're going to tell you who they are, where they work, who funds them, what issue areas they work in, all the information that you would need, basic biodata form to say, they're interesting, they fit my mandate, and I'm interested in talking to them, and you can link up with them. So that platform is being prototyped, and we hope to launch it in Q2 of next year. The other barrier that we hear all the time, and this is the last point, is that Samantha Powers has a long uphill battle. The ambition is extraordinary, but it's very difficult to change the rules and regulation of a machinery like US government with all the restrictions that have been placed on USAID by Congress, all the things that you were talking about, Fatima. So these are really difficult changes to happen. She has put a lot of her political capital on the line to make this happen, and I respect her for doing that, but it's not an easy thing. So how does she find Global South organizations that can absorb the big dollars USAID wants to spend, the $50 million grant, one grant, the $100 million, one grant. This is why the UN and the Kamonics of the world and the NGOs don't exist by accident, they exist by design. To burn money, to allow the bilaterals as a way to have a mechanism to absorb their resources. So this is why we're starting a private company, a social enterprise that would allow local organizations to outsource their back end, they outsource the things that they're most non-compliant on, like procurement, finance, HR. Outsourcing is very common in the private sector. It's a little common in the nonprofit space, but it's not available to Global South organizations. So this company is called CORE, and we hope to launch it in a year. And it will allow an organization that's assessed today to be high risk, hopefully in a year to be able to be assessed to be low risk, and then hopefully be able to take funding from a Gates Foundation, USAID, DFID, or whoever it might be.
Whew. So from each of you and your unique perspectives, we heard a lot about how to navigate the traditional big baddies, right? Ways to transform and even co-opt the NGOs that we have often scapegoated as the source of all evil when it comes to international development. We've also figured out ways to navigate the pathways of the ex-lateral system, another oft sort of scapegoat group. I want to bring us back to the captive audience we have here. And from each of you, I want to sort of walk through a round robin really quickly and say you have this captive and well-intentioned audience. The theme is investing in local knowledge. What is the way that we can accelerate people down a pathway of action, away from rhetoric and give proof to purpose when it comes to investing in local knowledge? Maven, maybe we can start with you.
So first I want to say, Andy, I think you were wrong in your opening statement about not being able to solve a problem with $50 billion. So I'm going to challenge you on that one. Oh, someone else agrees. Okay, that's good. So I'm going to tell you like a good news, bad news story, but there is so much potential here. So just a month ago at the UN General Assembly, USAID announced one of the most historic funding mechanisms ever in global health around malnutrition. It was a $500 million contribution that they have come forward with. This is an epic amount of money to go into one space, so that for the first time we will actually be able to see us move the needle in our space. So right now we were reaching 25% of the world's severely malnourished children. Now In 2023, by the end of that year, we will be at 50%. 25 to 50% is an enormous gain. Then we have the funding that will actually bring us to 75%. And what is after that? We can actually complete the goal. We can actually end malnutrition. We are so close, and we are in the process of doing all of that. So in this epic historic investment was lots of money for procurement, so the purchasing of these products. There's programming, which is to the healthcare workers who have to weigh and measure children, educate, distribute, and do all of that work in the ground is also necessary. But the one thing that wasn't funded, because you need all three of these things to make the whole program work, was to fund the factories. So I'm asking for a friend. Okay, a friend, yeah. This friend is looking for $8 million to buy equipment to scale up a little factory in Rhode Island. She lives there. And this would allow us to leverage some of this $500 million of orders that are in the queue. In addition to that, to keep with our theme on local, we also we're looking for people who want to invest in a for-profit in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, and in Sudan. These factories are also looking to scale up, are also looking for equipment. This will have a known ROI. We know what we can do with this. We have all the tools to solve this problem. We're so close. And so that's something that I'm advocating for as well, is investing in these local partners is critical to this entire ecosystem. And when we all work together and we all partner with big governments, small NGOs, big NGOs, everything, we can actually move the needle in global health like we've never seen it before.
Dagan, would you go next?
So if I were in your shoes as funders, let me put a couple of concrete ideas on the table. So first, I would take a very systems approach. Shifting funding is necessary and insufficient all on itself, right? And I think we know that. But it's absolutely the necessary first step. But we still need a systems approach to think about what are the causes that are driving, whether it's malnutrition, whether it's gender-based violence, whatever the issue is that we care about, is systematically rooted in something. And the partnerships piece, and the partnerships are global. They're local and they're global, really do matter. If I were in your shoes, here's 3 practical things that you could do to think differently. First is change your clock. So, I worked 5 years on the Hill. Trust me, I know annual appropriation cycles and funding cycles. And I used to always say, back in the day when the US was giving in a supplemental loan in 2009, $4.2 billion to Afghanistan, we all knew that that money could not be absorbed. What if you didn't have to spend all that money at once? Right? What if you allocated it up front because you have to get it off your books? But you could set it up in either a trust fund or other vehicles that you're smart, you all have investment advisors to set up these vehicles in ways where you can take time to execute the funding and your partners have more breathing room to be able to do it. So first is change the clock. And this way, you have real pressures with your boards, with the stock market, with other things that are really important. But thinking through temporal changes could actually change the entire ecosystem and the pressures that are faced downstream. The second, and you said this about the cover, but the systems approach, change the procurement. So the real reason USAID and others are structurally in a very difficult place is because you have systems built up, including procurement systems, that are fundamentally fixed in contracts, like including IDIQ contracts, which are very sticky to change because they're multi-year contracts. If US funders actually put pressure to change the procurement vehicles, everyone has to pay attention to that now, right? That's what accountability is. Accountability is not just the front end, it's actually the back end of a lot of the way the funding flows actually work. So I have to take very seriously, if I were back in government, for instance, and Congress passes a law changing my procurement mechanism, there's nothing that's going to get me to move faster than that accountability mechanism. In many ways, you're not just funders with money, you are the accountability mechanism. if you think about your power in those ways. And then the third thing I would say is think differently about your financial vehicles. I think the silos that we've created across ODA, philanthropy, and the private sector are actually false and artificial and of our own creation. In fact, in many ways, the wealth was not generated through those silos. The wealth was generated through blended finance across different assets and investment portfolios. Some made money, some lost money. But when it evened out, you have assets that you then can deploy in ways that fulfill your missions. What if we change the blended finance opportunities with the private sector, for instance? So if 1% of development financing is ODA, where's the remaining 99% going to come from? Philanthropy alone will not be able to do that. We know that. It doesn't have to. But new ways of blended finance with the vehicles, that could be grants, it could be equity, it could be debt vehicles, it could be loans. Make the investment. Make the investment as people because they're worth an investment. In many cases, that will have an ROI. I wouldn't want to go too far and profitize all of it because I think you would get into some debt traps that we have to be, social traps we'd have to be careful about. But I think there's a lot of lessons learned in the blended finance space that the private sector is leaning into that would be very attractive in the philanthropic spaces as well as you think about that. So I just wanted to summarize all that by saying that as you decide to shift the funding and the power, I think there's a lot that you can unlock there around accountability, transparency, and systems approaches that actually are a sweet spot for the very mission statements that many of your organizations work on.
Take us home.
So I did my homework already because the points I want to end in are already in the article. So I'm just going to read for you from the article, the recommendations. So fund proximate, obviously, not just organizations, but the leaders themselves. Collaborate, don't delegate. Work on issues with the governments and communities who are impacted. Fund courageously and trust generously. These leaders will not have the sophisticated back-end machinery that American and European organizations have built over the past 60 years, so give them the unrestricted investment they need to build it. Provide flexible funding. I don't think I have to explain that. Provide long-term funding. I shouldn't have to explain that. Help individual organizations scale. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by scale, because I don't believe, philanthropy loves the word scale, and I'm actually allergic to it. But what I mean here by scale is follow the path of Mackenzie Scott. The grant that Mackenzie Scott gave us was a large grant. It was a one-time grant. It was not even a grant, it was a gift, and it felt like a gift. But because it was the size of the grant, or the size of the gift, it allowed us to make different decisions. Just like you, having a salary of $100 or $1,000 coming to you every week, you'll make different decisions. Human beings plan differently based on what's coming in. Same thing with institutions, same thing with poor people. But we tend to starve these organizations. Instead of giving them $1 million every year for 5 years, give them $5 million one time and let them use that money to invest and start an endowment. That's what I mean. That's real self-reliance. That's real self-determination. Consider skipping proposals and requests for proposals. And fund for self-determination, like I said. So funding that is significant, transformative, can help local organizations build stability and financial independence and transition from being service deliverers to real advocates. You cannot be civil society unless you get out of the business of providing services and you go back into your root mandate of being civil society, which means to hold the government accountable, to being holding private sector accountable, to holding the philanthropy accountable. But you cannot do that if your funding is 100% focused on providing programs and services for an INGO or UN agency. If you want these organizations to really address food sovereignty issues, to address the political issues that have been left on our shoulders from these unprincipled and neo-colonial governance systems that are very political. When we talk about decolonization, these are very political issues, these global governance systems, the Bretton Woods institutions. That requires movement of people and power and advocacy that these organizations don't have the resources for. So get them out of the business of delivering services and get them into the business of being real civil society.
There you have it. If you want to do good and look good in front of your board, you stand on the shoulders of giants. If you want to design a convening that changes the face of your community, look to GPF's example. Flattery is the ultimate form of getting called back next year. And if you want to spend the next couple days investing in local knowledge by listening to it, talk to Humphrey from Reach a Hand Uganda, talk to Monica from Girl Up, talk to Isabel from Solid Africa, talk to a few of the other doers, the talent, the true honest-to-goodness giants in this room that the GPF, in their wisdom, have allowed through this hallowed gate, and learn how you can be useful and worthy of the honor and privilege to be partnering with local rock stars and visionaries. So with that, thanks everybody, and on to the hot cocktail. Nice job.